Let me tell you something that should disturb every American who's paying attention. Right now, as you're watching this, there are sailors aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln who have been at sea for over 250 days. 250 days. No port call, no rotation, no relief. And some of them are jumping overboard to get off that ship. Not in combat, not under enemy fire. They are jumping into open ocean to escape their own chain of command. Now ask yourself this question. When is the last time you heard of that happening in the United States Navy? In peacetime, or what passes for peacetime right now. I'll tell you when. You haven't. Because this doesn't happen in a military that is functioning. This doesn't happen when leadership is working. This happens when something has gone fundamentally catastrophically wrong, from the top all the way down. And what I'm going to tell you today is this. Donald Trump has lost control of his own military, not because of the enemy, not because of Iran, not because of any external threat. He's lost control because of the people he chose to listen to, the advisors he chose to trust, and the decisions he allowed others to make for him. And it is getting worse by the day. Now, I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I've spent decades in uniform. I've commanded forces. I've sat in rooms where decisions like these were made, and I've seen what happens when military leadership fails its people. Not in theory, not in a war college classroom, in the field, on the ground, at sea. I was at West Point teaching young officers when a 3-star general stood in front of us and told us that every single cadet who walked through those doors was qualified to graduate. That they were the best and the brightest, and it was our job, not to challenge them, but to make them successful. I looked at that general and I thought, what planet is this man on? Because that is not what military leadership is. That is not what forges soldiers. That is not what builds the kind of institutional backbone that gets you through 250 days at sea without men jumping overboard. And I've been saying for years, that we have built a military culture that rewards compliance over competence, careerism over courage, and political calculation over professional judgment. What we are seeing right now with the Abraham Lincoln is not an isolated incident. It is the inevitable consequence of everything I warned about. And the tragedy is that the people who could have stopped this, the admirals, the chiefs, the senior commanders, they said nothing. They did nothing. Because they were too focused on their next star and their next defense contractor board seat to pick up the phone and tell the president the truth. So let's talk about what's actually happening. Because what you're being told and what is actually true are two very different things. The official position from Washington is that the United States military remains the most powerful force on Earth, that we have control of the Strait of Hormuz, that our naval posture in the region is a demonstration of American strength and resolve. That is not what I'm hearing from the people who are actually out there. Let's start with the basics. A carrier strike group is not designed for sustained indefinite deployment. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been at sea continuously since late November. That's not a deployment. That's an occupation of your own sailors. Now, the Royal Navy in the Age of Sail, which was not exactly known for its humane treatment of enlisted men, understood that there was a limit. 6 months, that was the threshold. Beyond 6 months, you begin to lose the force cohesion, the psychological stability, the basic human functionality that makes a fighting unit capable of doing its job. We have blown past that threshold by a country mile. And what do we have to show for it? We say we control the strait. But let me ask you something. For the first time in 40 years, there has been zero oil flowing from Saudi Arabia to the United States through that corridor. Zero. If that's what control looks like, I would hate to see what losing looks like. The food aboard ships deteriorates. The maintenance cycles break down. The hot racking, where 3 sailors share 2 bunks in rotating shifts, grinds men down psychologically in ways that don't show up in any Pentagon briefing, but absolutely show up in retention rates, in performance, in the kind of desperation that makes a man jump into open ocean rather than spend one more day below deck. And here is the part that should make every American furious. This was knowable. This was predictable. Every flag officer in that chain of command knew, or should have known, that this was coming, and not one of them stood up. Let me give you two data points, two things that happened recently that, when you put them together, tell you everything you need to know about the state of American military readiness. First, the USS Abraham Lincoln. We now have confirmed reports, not rumors, confirmed reports, of multiple sailors being prevented from going overboard. Multiple sailors, on an active carrier strike group. Sailors who would rather take their chances with the ocean than remain on that ship. Now stop and think about what that means operationally. You have a capital ship, a ship that costs $13 billion, that carries 5,000 sailors and Marines, that is supposed to project American power across the most strategically critical waterway on Earth. And the men and women aboard it are in a state of psychological collapse. That is not a ship that is ready to fight. That is not a strike group that is going to deter anyone. That is a liability. Second data point, the Wargames in Germany. Earlier this year, in a series of exercises that didn't get nearly the attention they deserved, Ukrainian forces, veterans who have been fighting a grinding, brutal war against Russia for 4 years, were brought in to train against American units. The result was not what anyone in the Pentagon wanted to hear. The Ukrainians employed the tactics they had learned in actual combat: drone warfare, precision indirect fire, the kind of decentralized, adaptive fighting that 4 years of existential conflict produces. And what happened? We were annihilated. Not competitive, annihilated. Now, I want to be very careful here, because some people will take that and say it means our army is incompetent, or our soldiers aren't brave, or our equipment isn't capable. That's not the point. Our soldiers are exceptional people. The problem is they have been trained, equipped, and organized for a kind of warfare that no longer exists. We have been fighting insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. Short duration, low intensity, permissive air environment conflicts against opponents who had no real air defense, no precision missiles, no drone swarms. And we became very, very good at that kind of war. The problem is, that is not the war we are now in. What we are seeing in the Middle East, what the Ukrainians experienced against Russia, what every serious military analyst has been warning about for a decade, this is a new battlefield. Space-based surveillance, precision-guided munitions in quantities we cannot match, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, tactical drones in numbers that are simply incomprehensible to a military that has spent a generation fighting people with AK-47s and roadside bombs. We broke the code on counterinsurgency. We never broke the code on this. And now we have men jumping off carriers, and we're getting annihilated in war games, and the President of the United States is being told we're winning. So who is responsible for this? Who is accountable? I want to work through this carefully, because accountability in an institution like the military is layered and it's complex. But let me start at the top of the chain and work my way down. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. He is constitutionally responsible for the military. And he has been, by every account I have seen, largely insulated from the reality of what his military is experiencing. He wanted a 2-minute highlight reel. 2 minutes of the best strikes, the best footage, the most impressive ordnance on target. That is what is being fed to him. What is not being fed to him is the number of sailors who have jumped overboard. What is not being fed to him is the result of those war games in Germany. What is not being fed to him is the fact that we have built a short war force structure and hurled it at a long war problem. And why is that? Because the people around him have made a calculation. Their calculation is that the president does not want to hear bad news, and so they give him good news. And in doing so, they have become complicit in a strategic catastrophe. Now let's talk about the admirals. The Chief of Naval Operations, the Commander of CENTCOM, the Secretary of the Navy, or rather, the man who is functioning in that role. In any properly functioning military institution, what should have happened, what was required by professional duty and moral obligation, is that one of these men should have gotten on a plane to Washington months ago, should have walked into the Oval Office, should have said, "Mr. President, I cannot maintain this posture. My people are breaking down. We are not ready for what you are asking us to do. We need to change course. That conversation did not happen. And why? Because we have spent 30 years building a general officer and flag officer corps that is exquisitely calibrated for one thing: advancement. Every general, every admiral, as I have said many times, wants one thing for Christmas: another star. And then beyond that star, the defense contractor board, the speaking circuit, the consulting fees. You do not get those things by walking into the Oval Office and telling a president that his war is failing. You get those things by finding a way to make the numbers look acceptable, by managing the optics, by ensuring that the bad news is buried deep enough in the classified annexes that nobody who matters ever reads it. That is the system we have built. And that system is now producing men who jump off carriers. And then there is the question of external pressure. There are individuals connected to organizations outside the military chain of command who have apparently been given access to advise operational commanders. Unless the President of the United States personally authorized that, it should not be happening. And the fact that it apparently is tells you something important about whose interests this war is actually serving. Here's the thing about institutional collapse. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a press conference. It accumulates quietly, in small decisions and overlooked signals, until suddenly the dam breaks and everyone acts surprised. We saw this before. The British Army before World War I is the textbook case. The British had spent a century fighting what they called small wars, colonial conflicts inside the empire. They were extraordinarily good at it, mobile, adaptive, professional, and they concluded from this experience that they were the finest military force in the world. What they were not prepared for was fighting a continental power. When they met the Germans on the Western Front in 1914, they discovered in the most brutal way possible that the skills required to fight a colonial rebellion were not the skills required to survive industrial warfare. Sound familiar? We are a military that has become world-class at one kind of war, and we are now in a completely different kind of war. And the people making decisions either don't know the difference or are pretending not to. And here is the deeper parallel that nobody wants to talk about. In 1914, the British generals knew, many of them knew that the army was not structured correctly, that the training was wrong, that the doctrine was outdated, but they said nothing, because the system rewarded loyalty to the consensus and punished those who challenged it. There was a naval officer who came back to a reunion at the Naval Academy, the American one, after spending years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi. His classmates told him, "Don't worry, everything has changed. All that brutal plebe year pressure is gone. It's much better now." And he looked at them and he said, "That plebe year is what got me through Hanoi. You see what I'm saying? The very things we have eliminated from military training and culture, the hardship, the institutional challenge, the forcing of young people to confront their own limits, those are precisely the things that build the psychological resilience you need when you have been at sea for 250 days and you have to decide whether to maintain your post or abandon ship. We have optimized our military for comfort and for optics, and we are now paying the price. There is one more historical data point I want to leave you with. Warfare itself has changed. What we are seeing in the region today, the mass employment of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drone swarms, space-based targeting, this is not World War II. This is not the kind of war where a carrier strike group steams into the fight and dominates by presence alone. This is much closer to 1916, to the Western Front, to the grinding, attritional, defensive-dominated warfare where the side with the most missiles and the most patience wins. Not the side with the most courage, not the side with the best pilots, the side that has built the industrial capacity to sustain the fight indefinitely. Iran has spent 30 years building that capacity. We have spent 30 years assuming we wouldn't need it. So let me give you my assessment. Straight, no hedging. Donald Trump is not in control of his military. The people who should be giving him accurate information are not doing so. The commanders who should be protecting their people are not doing so. The USS Abraham Lincoln situation is not an anomaly. It is a symptom. It is what happens when you take a short war force, designed, structured, and funded for conflicts that last weeks or months, and you commit it to an open-ended campaign against an adversary that has spent 30 years preparing for exactly this fight. Iran is not weak. Iran is not collapsing. The new leadership that has emerged from this conflict is harder and more determined than what we started fighting, and we are more depleted than we were when we started. The math is not complicated. We are expending resources we cannot quickly replace. We are burning through a force we cannot quickly rebuild. We are alienating partners across the region who are concluding, correctly, that the United States is a liability, not an asset. And the president is watching a 2-minute highlight reel. I'll say one more thing, and I want you to think about it carefully. The polling data on this war is unambiguous. Over 70% of Americans do not want this conflict. If Donald Trump stood up tomorrow and said, "We are disengaging, we are withdrawing our forces, we are done," he would be cheered from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He has the authority to do that. He could do it tomorrow. The question every American should be asking is, why isn't he? I don't want to leave you without anything, because I think there are things that can still be done. And history tells us that institutions can correct themselves when the right people find the courage to speak at the right moment. We did something like this in the 1970s, after Vietnam. After the catastrophic institutional failures of that war, we brought in German generals, men who had actually fought on both fronts, against the Soviets and against us, and we listened to them. We allowed them to reshape the way we thought about combined arms warfare, about what a modern military actually needs to be. And it worked. The transformation of the U.S. Army in the 1980s that produced the force that performed so well in 1991, that transformation came from being willing to admit that what we had been doing was wrong. From leaders who were secure enough to accept that verdict and change course. We did it then. We can do it now. But it requires someone, somewhere in that building, somewhere in that chain of command, who will stand up, who will get on a plane to Washington, who will walk into the Oval Office and say, "This is what is actually happening on those ships. This is what actually happened in those war games in Germany. And this is what will happen if we do not change course." That person exists. In every institution, in every crisis, there is someone who sees clearly. The question is whether the system will allow them to speak. What I know for certain is this: the longer we wait, the worse it gets. Every day that passes is another day on that carrier. Another day of strategic drift. Another day of a military that is being consumed, not by the enemy, but by its own leadership's unwillingness to tell the truth. The military can recover from this. It has recovered from worse, but not without leadership. And right now, that leadership is nowhere to be seen.